The legendary Steve Jobs took Apple from a garage to a billion-dollar company in 9 years. And then the Apple board of directors fired him. It was such a bad decision that 12 years later, they had to beg him to come back and save the company. But guess what? They would do it all over again. Why? Human psychology. It wasn't that Jobs lacked talent. Everyone knew he was a genius. The reason they kicked him out, nothing to do with skill. But once you hear it, you'll never see networking and interviews and relationships in the same way again. Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to tell you the single biggest reason talented people get ignored for promotion and opportunities, even when everyone admits they're the most skilled. You'll walk away with zero fluff ways to make sure your talent finally gets the recognition it deserves, and it will all be backed by science. It's 1985. Steve Jobs is still the CEO of Apple. He is universally acknowledged across the world as a marketing genius, a tech visionary, and one of the greatest innovators alive. And yet the board of directors chooses to replace him with another executive, and that decision made total sense to them at the time. Why? Jobs was also seen as abrasive. He publicly humiliated employees. He created what we call today a toxic culture and alienated almost everyone around him. In other words, he had unbelievable competence, but also zero perceived warmth. So guess which one won at the end? The point is this: raw talent, even at the extreme, is not enough, not even close. And science has already discovered this almost 80 years ago. So let's dive into the research and find out why. The idea behind this research is that we have to get some order and find out what actually matters when it comes to how people form opinions about us. How many hours have you spent wondering what people really think of you? It's perfectly natural, but also not the best way to spend your time. I personally used to invent entire horror stories in my head, which were completely false, about what other people think of me, until I learned about this research. So it turns out that people are not nearly as complicated as we might imagine. In fact, there are two questions that people unconsciously ask themselves when they form their opinions about us. Those questions are, first, is this person here to help me or hurt me? And second, is this person competent and capable enough to pull it off? That's it. Everything else is just noise. These two questions determine about 80 to 90% of the impressions that people get of us. Here are some of the studies that make this point. Imagine I give you two strangers. The first person is intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious. And the second person is exactly the same, except that I replaced the word warm with the word cold. It turns out that changing this single word from warm to cold flipped the entire impression on its head. Seeing the word warm made people interpret every other trait positively, and seeing the word cold made people interpret every other trait negatively. So for example, whereas people interpreted intelligent as smart under the warm lens, they interpret it as cunning or devious when they use the cold lens. Another example, whereas they interpreted determined as dependable with the warm lens, it became stubborn with the cold lens. Practical was realistic with the warm lens and calculating with the cold lens. Cautious was careful with the warm lens, and somebody who doesn't trust anybody with the cold lens. In other words, warmth anchored every other trait in the list. This study was done almost 80 years ago. So fast forward 22 years, in another study, researchers asked people to describe somebody they knew using any words that they wanted. The researchers obviously collected hundreds of these traits and words, and they ran a statistical analysis to figure out if these traits were organized in any clear way. It turned out that 82% of all these traits fell into one of two buckets. The first bucket was the warmth bucket, something about the person's social qualities, and the second bucket was the competence bucket, something about that person's intellectual qualities. It turns out that any group in society is seen through these two dimensions, warmth and competence. For example, and I'm not saying this is necessarily my opinion, but this is how the average person saw the following groups. Rich people were seen as cold and competent. Housewives were seen as warm and not particularly competent. Criminals were seen as low on both. So you can see how warmth and competence permeates the impressions that we have on people. And this creates a matrix. We can have people that we know are high on warmth and high on competence. These are people we usually admire. We can have people who are high on warmth and low on competence, people we usually feel sorry for. We can have people who are low on warmth and high on competence. These are people we resent or envy. This is Steve Jobs in 1985. And we can have people who are low on both, and these are people we are usually disgusted by and don't want to spend any time with. Looking at this matrix, it's clear that our goal should be to be perceived as high on both. Now that we know this, let's talk about the relationship between warmth and competence. The way it works is warmth is the gatekeeper. Studies show that it's judged much faster than competence and carries the majority of the total impression. For example, in a recent study, researchers asked people to tell them who they like working with in their company. It turned out that people liked working with those they saw as high on warmth and also high on competence. Surprise, surprise. However, if they didn't like you, if they didn't think you were warm, then it didn't matter how competent you were. Nobody wanted to work with you. So you could have been the most skilled person in the company, but if you weren't seen as warm, nobody wanted to work with you. So now we can understand why many of us know extremely competent people who never seem to get promoted or appreciated because they are perceived as cold. To some of you, this may sound very familiar. On the other hand, this might also explain why there are many people who are not particularly competent but seem to get promoted very quickly. To others of you, this may hit home. Now, this might seem unfair because we see ourselves in a much less superficial light in these two dimensions. But it's important to remember that warmth and competence are different from our personalities. If you've ever taken a personality test, you know there are more than two dimensions in most of them. This is because when we assess ourselves, we see much more complexity than when we assess other people. Warmth and competence are perceptions. This is what people think of us. They're components of our reputation, not who we actually are. When others look at us, they don't care about 87 nuances that we care about. Other people just want to know the two key questions. The first one, are we there to help them or hurt them? That's warmth. And the second one, can we pull it off? Can we achieve goals? That's competent. That's it. So what actually works? Here are 4 tips. First, never lead with pure competence. Talking about your achievement and skills, or even showing your skilled actions to somebody who does not yet like you or does not yet think that you're warm, is going to sound a lot like bragging, and it's going to make people resent you. Second, you don't need to become Mother Teresa to be perceived as warm. Being reliably kind and nice is the way to go. Warmth is not something that you maximize, it's something that you achieve and move on. So for example, making good on your promises is just as good as over-delivering. Giving a small compliment is just as good as a big one, and granting a small favor is just as good as giving a big one. Research shows that moderate warmth beats extreme warmth because it leads to the same impression but with less cost to you. Third, be a little bit nice to many people rather than extremely nice to a few people. This is because being nice and being generous has a cost associated with it. It costs you something to help another person, your effort, your time, your resources. So what you want to do is help many people in a small way to build up their best reputation. Fourth, signal your warmth and helpfulness as often as you can. Do small favors. Give genuine compliments. Make clear statements like, I'm on your team, I'm happy to help. Here's an example of a line you can use to convey warmth without losing respect. You can say, I genuinely want you to succeed and I'm going to try to make that happen. That's it. Keep doing that over and over again. If you've encountered a situation where you thought, I'm clearly the best, why don't people see it? Well, now you know. They do see your talent, but their perceptions of you as a cold person is what's holding you back. Fix perceptions of your warmth first and your competence will get noticed. If this video was helpful, hit the like. It tells the algorithm to show it to more people who need it. Comment below. In what areas of life have you seen people who are extremely competent, but competence alone did not get them to where they wanted to be? I read your comment. And finally, subscribe. Every week I'm going to break down research that will help you in your leadership, in your self-development, and in your career. So thanks for watching, and go signal a little warmth today. You'll be shocked at how fast doors open for you.